Record. All right. Hi, guys. So just really quick, I wanted to go over agenda for the day. We are a quick introduction of this depth and complexity through icons. And we're going to do a little warm-up so you can kind of see the different tools that I have for you today. And then we're going to do a little bit of whole group. And then I said grade level, but we can just kind of stick where we're at. And then I want you to kind of throw out some ideas on how you think that you can utilize what you learned today in your own classroom or amongst planning. I have a whole resource folder set up for y'all so y'all can go in and make copies, print, or whatever you need to do. And then before you leave today, I have an evaluation form. It's anonymous, but just let me know how you did. And then I'd also like feedback on, because we normally do like little 20-minute segments of PD sessions in our regular department meetings, and I'd like to see like what you're interested in, and so that we can start collecting the rest of the department together to teach those during the department meeting. And then Jen's going to do a tech moment at the end to clarify grade book teams or anything that we may need. Okay? All right. So Chris and I were in this training this summer, and it was about depth and complexity and raising a level of thinking in your classroom. And I have to admit, we were a little skeptical first. We were like, okay, we're just trying to get our GT hours. And it ended up being this little diamond in the rough, and we thought it was really cool. We hadn't had a lot of time to throw it together, but because of this, we were able to, so we're kind of really excited to share it with y'all today. So just a little bit about what depth and complexity is. It's just allowing teachers to have different ways to raise that level of thinking, grade level, and content. And when we were going through this, we thought it was really cool because it really you can manipulate these cards that we have in front of you based on the level of your groups, your classes, or whatever you need to do. So it's not just that one thing that you have to do. They don't have to work together, or they can work together. And so they're represented by a set of icons. So there's 11 icons. I feel like a lot of times buzzwords are just kind of thrown around and we don't really know what they mean. So I kind of wanted to do the difference between depth and complexity. So depth is just about moving those kids towards like a greater thing, more balance, more goals, more content coverage, but complexity is that challenging component. Challenge them to make those connections on how things change over time or across disciplines or anything like that. So that's kind of this. So we were kind of talking too about how this could probably be related to our rigor and relevance rubric too, once we kind of make those connections. Okay, so there's 11 elements divided into depth and complexity. So you have a bag with these cards. These cards are yours to take with you. If you want to make more, in our resource folder, I have these already made and we can print them out and print them out in color and then get them laminated. But I want you to go ahead and kind of lay them out in front of you and kind of see them all together. And we're going to be using them throughout today.
And one thing that we found in our training, when the instructor first started talking, she was like, hey, all my elementary teachers. And Mandy and I looked at each other like, are we in the right training? So we were the only two high school representatives there. But what we found is these ideas, even though they may appear simplistic, and you're looking at icons with cards and bright colors, that really, even if they are starting at the elementary level and the junior high level, right, once they get to high school, that these can be really valuable tools to get students thinking deeper and making those different connections. So.
And that's kind of what we learned through this, because at first, like, she was gearing the whole professional development towards elementary, and then Alana Woods came on and we were like, we have AP and IB teachers in here. But she was able to like quickly shift the gears, and so that made me realize too that it doesn't matter the level of your classroom or anything like that, you should be able to apply. So they're broken into, so there's 8 depth elements. You have language of discipline, and we're gonna go over all these in a little bit. Details, patterns, unanswered questions, rules, trends, ethics, and then big idea. And then you have the 3 complexity elements, which gets them to think across disciplines and multiple perspectives, and then the changes over time. Okay, so we kind of want to start off a warm-up to kind of get you into what the icons mean and how to respond to them. So we're going to ask a couple questions, but the focus question is, when it comes to ways to increase thinking levels in your classroom, what are some thoughts and concerns that you have as a teacher? So what I want to show you is your first digital resource, and they already have an icon wheel that you can put up on your interactive board. And if you want to do like a quick warm-up or an exit ticket, all you have to do is tap a spin and it'll stop. All right, so we have big ideas. So what are some challenges in your own classrooms that you have when you try to get the kids to think about the big idea? What do y'all have?
Kind of their experiences sometimes don't lend them to think of their world in terms of big ideas or big concepts.
Right, so they can't apply it outside their world.
Students in their personal big idea is not going to be necessarily cohesive with somebody else's big idea, which is a good thing. But in the beginning, it means that there's a lot of things to try and bring together if you're having multiple students answer.
Right, and it's those little components that build up to that big idea too, right? So as a teacher, like when you, in your own field, in your own profession, how do you struggle in thinking of the big idea when you sit down to plan or talk as a team or anything like that?
I think the same thing. Like the teachers come together as a team and they sit there and like everybody has a kind of different approach to the big idea. They trying to get it to be cohesive is a little hard sometimes.
That's cool.
I think also sometimes it's the small things that get in the way. It's
Right.
of the big idea. You get focused in on the specific
details.
Yeah, the specific details, and you're not thinking of the whole picture.
All right, so the thing with this is you can choose to close it and the icon will stay on the wheel, or say if you wanted to ask more questions, then you hit remove and it will remove that icon from the wheel, so then you can make sure that it doesn't land on big idea again. And then of course, if you want all the icons flat back up, you just hit refresh. So let's just do it one more time for fun. It is fun. You could even have the kids come up here. Ooh. So here's a question for you, teaching-wise, and I know, how has our profession changed over time, and what do you think?
I have no idea.
David?
Well, I immediately thought of overhead transparency. Well, the technology has been a huge change in the time, at least the time I've been here. It started with the department that we had one computer for the entire department, and we had a secretary. So if you needed something typed, basically she would type it on the computer, but that was it.
I think the rigor too has changed. I mean, I think about when I first started teaching, it was handouts and fill in the blank. Again, years and years ago. Either that or we were doing it wrong wherever I came from.
I always talk about,
Yeah, I mean, seriously, the kids weren't as, to me, we didn't challenge them as much then at all.
And I think it used to be more teacher-based. Now we want it to be
Oh,
more
absolutely.
student-led.
very much so.
So how have the students changed over time? Or have they?
I think it's that technology component plays into that. But I had a conversation yesterday with a student that wanted to know why I made him look up a word in the dictionary, right? Because in his world, that's not a resource. And so just like those shifts and understanding and
I don't know too, it's just they have just so much access to knowledge too. Like I remember, even when I started and we were just like writing personal narratives and making sure that we just understood what we wrote, and they just didn't need that need for that additional knowledge that applies like we have. And then now, if we want to know something, we just flip out our phones and we just check it. And I think that's a lot of times it's so easy, then I think that kind of makes them a lot that because I can just figure it out this way.
It's creativity.
It's also, I was gonna say a detriment too, because now that all that information is right here, whereas we had to kind of ponder that question and be like, who was that guy in that TV show until we could go look it up, or until we could ask somebody to figure it out. Now that question is, oh, what is that? I'm like, whatever, I can look that up later. But they never look it up later. So that learning desire is also gone.
I think it affects too, like how they relate to the teachers and the adults. Because I remember being, not that old, but I remember being a person in school and learning things. And if I didn't know something, I had to go ask an adult. right? And then they would tell me, and that built sort of a rapport with them that I understood they were smarter than me and had knowledge that I didn't have. Whereas I think kids are much more independent now, and they have sometimes this mentality that I don't need you. I can just go look it up.
Or each other, and that's why the group work is
Yeah.
a little bit harder
That's a really
to
good point.
All right, so that is the wheel of knowledge. That is in the slideshow, and you can use it however you see fit. So just take a really quick kind of review. So I gave you the hands-on resources. You have cards that you can use in your classroom. The grid will sit there and help you, give you a little bit more specifics on what the icon means and some questions that you could ask. And then the other thing is for you to take notes today. They already have the definitions written for you, but if there's any ideas that pop up in your head, you can take a note on how to apply it in your classroom. And then there's digital resources. The slideshow from today also has embedded resources that you can go through and click the links and get you to where you need to go. There's various activities. There's a whole document of like question stems for each of the icons for you too. So if you need guiding questions, then you can just print that and have that as well. And then of course I put the digital wheel in there for you. So we're gonna go over depth first, and then we're gonna move into complexity. So we're just going to be working with those icons for now. And this just kind of works towards uncovering details over whatever you're studying, encourages students to think a little bit differently, maybe see some patterns, and kind of just make the difference between those concrete details that they can find, you know, in the text or whatever they're reading, and then kind of make that abstract concept, that thinking, like because of these concrete details, I know this about the world or perspectives or whatever. And then I like that it actually kind of puts ownership back on the kids because it's their job to kind of go and examine and determine the facts and the ideas that they want to get through. So we're going to do a little whole class modeling. Kristen's going to kind of take over from here, and then I'm just going to kind of interject when you need to. But I want you, like when we get to an icon, like pull that icon out so you can kind of start associating the icon with what we're talking about and so on. You ready?
Okay, so the first icon we're looking at is the lips that you got there, right? Language of discipline, right? When we think of language of discipline, what do we think of? Anybody? The terminology, right? Academic vocabulary, right? Okay, those types of things. Mandy kind of put on here some examples that apply to English language arts, descriptive words, interpretation of vocabulary, style, moving from plot up to theme. If you look on the left-hand side too, there are some different things that kind of go in this category as well. Maybe the lexicon of a particular piece of text, jargon, idioms, signs and symbols, and figures of speech. So what I did is I was thinking in terms of a story that all of us know so that we can maybe practice with this. So for instance, language of discipline, Romeo and Juliet. Everyone knows the story of Romeo and Juliet, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some terminology, what are some vocabulary words perhaps that relate to English, our academic vocabulary, that kids would need to know or understand for Romeo and Juliet?
Like
Soliloquy. Yeah, soliloquy. Okay, anything else?
Stage direction.
Stage direction. Drama, right?
Irony.
Okay, irony. I am the contender, right? Okay. And then some other things too in the story itself. I know you don't have a copy of the story in front of you, but any vocabulary that you can remember that kids may not be familiar with that they would need to know or look up or use context clues.
Wherefore art thou?
Way out where?
Old English.
Old English, right? Shakespearean language, maybe.
Adieu.
Adieu, right? When I was looking up stuff for this, like the term apothecary, right? That's in there, along with some others. So what you could do then is you would give either kids this card and they would come up with their own questions like this related to it, okay? Or you would give them the question stems. And so some of the question stems that might go, how does Romeo use a soliloquy to profess his love, right? Find examples of figurative language in the text to explain their purpose, right? And the effect on the reader. How is Romeo and Juliet a dramatic tragedy? How did the use of stage directions give us insight into the characters? Okay, so that's just kind of an example taking Romeo and Juliet. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it's less about like defining the terms and it's more about a question involving the terms.
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Especially like even like I look at jargon, so I think of like slang, especially like dialect, and maybe that region and stuff like that. What that mean?
Yeah. Details, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? And then you notice a little flower icon there, which I think is a flower that's on your card. So it's like the petals of a flower. So details, these are the detail-specific things that we can find in the text that give us information about the characters, the setting, etc. Again, if you look on the left-hand side, there are some other things to look at. So clues, facts, features, data, ideas, traits, items, parts, particulars, specifics, attributes, okay? So again, using this with Romeo and Juliet, you could give the kids the card and if like some example question stems. What clues do we have that something bad would happen, right, at the end of the story? How is Romeo impulsive? So if you gave them the trait and they would have to go trace it with the details from the story. What details are given about the setting, right? Just those types of questions where, kind of like we're doing with our short answers right now, where they actually have to find the text evidence to kind of back up their idea or their inference. That's kind of what details is. Does that make sense?
And kind of the theory behind these icons is that we use them enough in class that the pictures, they start associating like those skills that they need to have off the pictures. So it's more like where, you know, if they do the wheels and that flower comes up, then they automatically know how to start looking. So they did say in the training that it takes a little time, you know, you have to introduce it, you know, and that's kind of like beginning of the year kind of thing. And then as they get used to, then they start recognizing the icons and know like kind of which gear to switch to as well. Right, we ready?
Patterns, okay, is the next one. And kind of self-explanatory, right? What patterns do we see? And again, if we're using Romeo and Juliet, a piece of text, what patterns do we see in the text? So like literally this is like what motifs, right? Do we see in Romeo and Juliet? You could ask students specifically about light and dark imagery, how that pattern or motif relates to a particular theme. What can we predict about Romeo's future based on his behavior in the beginning of the story, right? Are there any patterns that we might already see? And how is the concept of time, you know, repeated throughout? So again, this one really relates, I think, to motif, which we kind of taught today or talked about in English too. But again, kind of looking at those repeated aspects of a work. And then rules. Again, kind of looking at rules of a particular genre, right? So when we're thinking of a drama, what kind of rules do we associate with drama? Our structure, if that helps.
Well, I mean, that traditional plot structure, right?
That traditional plot structure, 5 acts,
yeah.
right? 3rd act, climax, right? Okay. So the traditional plot structure. You could also take it to be the rules of society, right, within the piece of text you're working with. So with Romeo and Juliet, you know, what are the societal norms about marriage or wealth or something to that effect, or with kids following, you know, what their parents dictate. So again, looking at either the genre structure or whatever kind of rules that we see within a piece of text.
What we started noticing too is that some of these icons match with our writing process too. So like if you wanted to talk about the rules of, you know, your persuasive essay or your expository essay, then that's when you could throw out the rules card. And I mean, hopefully, you know, we've been teaching them, but I think a lot of times like we teach and then they don't necessarily retain. So that's when, you know, even for a quick warm-up, you could throw the rules up there and be like, all right, what are the rules that we're going to write today? And so it's cool because some of these, if you go back and look at the slide, they correlate with like a specific type of writing, which was kind of cool.
Trends. So this is kind of looking at, again, trends, not necessarily over time, right? But I guess we already talked about patterns, but
It's more like historical too,
yeah.
like society norms, like in your what's happening in that time period, and then how has that changed over time? How would things be differently? So, like, are you doing the Romeo and Juliet again?
Yeah, so with Romeo and Juliet, so like what influenced, were there influences from other works, right, that influenced Romeo and Juliet, or Shakespeare to write the story? Maybe the historical context and its effect on the characters and the development of the plot. Even relevancy to modern times. How has the story been told, you know, throughout, right? Romeo and Juliet to Great Gatsby to Titanic to Romeo and Juliet, right? We see it told a whole bunch of different ways. So just kind of seeing those trends throughout.
And I think like different interpretations, because we were talking about with Romeo and Juliet, you know, Leo DiCaprio version, you know.
That's one.
Yeah. It's cool the different interpretations and how that changes over time as well.
And then unanswered questions. Again, these are kind of those questions that we don't necessarily know, that we're left maybe wondering after we read a piece of text. So for instance, you know, whatever happened to Rosalind? You know, did she ever marry, right? What if, did the families actually live in peace afterwards, right? Okay, or do you think, you know, as soon as the story ended, maybe it was back to hatred between the families again, right?
Or when did thumb biting become an insult?
Ethics. So this is kind of looking at the controversies, dilemmas, morals, prejudices, etc. In a piece of work, right? What are some ethics that we could explore with Romeo and Juliet? Friar Lawrence, right? Okay, Friar Lawrence, right? So, because he's supposed to be this religious figure, right? But yet, what does he do? Right? Yeah. Okay. Lies to the parents. So again, kind of looking at that right and wrong, and looking at good versus bad. So Friar Lawrence, was he right in his deceitful actions? Should the nurse have told Juliet's parents as soon as she knew? How are morals expressed in the story? Okay. Do family values actually mean anything? At what age are you old enough to marry? Okay, or go against your parents? And were they wrong to be secretive about their love, right, or their plans?
I immediately thought of My Son Men too, with George and Lenny. That's kind of that's stuck in my head.
I thought, like, can you marry your cousin? Because they're all each other.
Well, how those ethics have changed over time too, so you can connect the two together.
So big ideas, I think this is kind of easier when you're looking at a piece of literature, right? Because with a piece of literature, what are we talking about? The big idea. Theme, right? Okay. So looking at the particular theme of a work, making sure students can identify, you know, what is the theme, what is the main conflict, what is the message about love, how do love and hate interact, et cetera, what's the role of destiny or fate, right? So kind of looking at the overarching message, at least for a piece of fiction, right?
So let's take a second and just in your groups really quick, just kind of talk about like with whatever you're reading, or how could you use some of those depth icons in your classroom? Like if you needed something like a warm up tomorrow or the next day, what could you do?
I was gonna say ethics will probably be probably forefront right there.
Yeah.
Especially where we are in
Specific to this, like noticing patterns of or noticing details about the setting of the beach versus yours, or whatever, like these are different. And I think even we struggle to like cover consistently the same things at the same time. So we were just like, did they have to even with total respect to each of the main characters, and then it would be like almost a single perspective. Like if we could like even just take this slide or throw it up on the board and say, guys, we're working with big ideas today. That means we're working with themes, and you see those things we need to know.
Kind of this constant trend, like hysteria.
So we're gonna have a list of facts.
I mean, we have
A lot of students talked about that.
It would be really cool. Everything.
And, you know,
I think
pattern details, he brings like students every day.
It feels like it's something we're already doing, but in greater organizations.
I guess, but it's like, feelings are. All of these basically formulated from that. And I'm like, well, that's hard because like, they said they all focus
And it's not like every time we have a list of, I need to cover
because they all connect to
details.
everything else. That's what I'm down. You know what I
There's a
mean?
discipline.
That's why I'm like,
Right,
this
it's like
it
we're
all
into
comes
the,
back
you know,
here.
it was a general, but I mean, it can be extended nonfiction, applied, general topics, just to get.
It's not like, oh, that's not a problem that is happening, because they're getting the skill.
I mean, it seems so basic, but then when we started
But
doing these and practicing.
I do think that it really helps us to feel like everybody has better when we come to planning sessions.
Yeah.
That we know what we did for the last 2 days, and we have the next 2 days. And then maybe they can get used to certain things. So like if every time we approach a book for the first time, we talk about language of the discipline, and we talk about what are gonna be the rules of the society, or the rules of the narrative, and we generate some unanswered questions that we want to answer as we read the book. Which is like every time I read a book, they're gonna see that every time, and they're gonna know this story and
I saw that.
Right, turns out time, or maybe even, right?
like one of us be like, oh, I got the language and the rules, or I forgot the answer question, or whatever, you know. But, we can at least start.
I literally, when I was at work, I'll go, but you'll.
I know, I did too. I gotta figure out so I've got long hair to go over there and just with my cursor click on it. Would probably.
All right, let's come back up here.
Get more engagement. Maybe they all come up
All right, so we just kind of want to talk briefly on the icons of complexity. Remember, there's only 3, and I feel like with the complexity icons, it's just going to be that moment, right? Kind of that, I don't know, I feel like maybe a more like final discussion or something like that. And this just really kind of includes making relationships, connecting other concepts together. Can bring in other disciplines like history or science or stuff like that. And just kind of see the associations and find multiple point of views. So we have change over time.
Which, pretty self-explanatory. This one, when she was presenting this one, she said it relates a lot to trends, right? But this is again kind of more of the bigger, wider lens, I guess, to look at it. So how has the setting changed either within the story over time or within the different variations that we've seen, right, of the Romeo and Juliet story being presented? How is it relevant to us today? So if we're reading Shakespeare, how is the story itself, how does it impact me, right? Why am I reading this? I can't even read the words. And other examples. So again, on the left, she has looking at the past, present, future, applying something historic to present knowledge, noting changes, or even predicting something in the future based on what they're reading. This one is my favorite. So multiple perspectives. There's a variety of ways I think students could apply multiple perspectives depending on what you're looking at. But like with literature, I was thinking maybe of lenses, right? When we look at literature through different lenses. So like with Romeo and Juliet, I don't know if we're going to apply, like look at it from a feminist perspective, right? So how, I don't know, how is the patriarch, seem to be, or portrayed to be the one in power, right? or psychoanalytical, you could explore like aspects of love and hate and how they work together, and the id, ego, superego. I mean, does Romeo even have an ego, right? So kind of looking through that, but also not just those lenses, but looking at different perspectives through each character, right? So if it's a story told in third person, well, what if it was told from Juliet's point of view? Or what if it was told from Mama Capulet? You know, how would things change? Would anything be different? That type of idea. So I really like, this is probably one of my favorite ones.
I was gonna say, there's a, Hamlet, right? Then you have Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, which is the perspective from, that's the
Yes.
entire story from their side, which is, so it's cool to have.
Yeah, well, and you're right, and same with, what am I thinking of, Beowulf, right?
Yeah.
And then you have Beowulf and Grendel story.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then this one's kind of self-explanatory across disciplines. How can this be relevant, right? The ideas presented, the characters presented, in other disciplines, right, in other content areas. Again, it's kind of a reach with Romeo and Juliet. I thought about maybe they could talk about the idea of poisons and, I don't know, like what happens to a body, or what type of poison, or what would it be that can make you go to sleep and come back? Maybe it's the sleeping pills that you took. But then also with but also with literature, I think we always have that historical context, and looking at, how does this apply in history, right? So that's kind of where I thought for that. But again, this one maybe a little bit more difficult, especially when we're looking at a work of fiction, right? A piece of nonfiction I think would be a little bit easier, but when we're looking at fiction, depending on what piece.
Yeah, but you also have, like Crucible, we were talking about with McCarthyism and that history
Oh,
repeating
yeah.
itself. Dusk
Yeah.
and the
Great Depression?
thank you. I was just testing you. But I mean, I think with some of our other, like, the other texts that we can pull those other disciplines
Yeah.
into it, and go from there. All right, so again, not necessarily grade level practice, but y'all kind of have sat together, and we want to kind of challenge you to kind of apply what we've kind of talked about and see how these icons work. So what you have in front of you on the table is what they call a conversational round table. And I think this can be manipulated in so many different ways. So what you see now is that you would have like a group of 3 or 4, and you would give them a topic, and they would each write their own point of view or perspective, and then they would bring that together to kind of create a big idea, which I think is cool when maybe at an end or a background information or whatever. What we want you to do today is pick a topic, preferably whatever you're reading in class, make it easy on yourselves. And we would like you to pick the icon. So just put the card in the corner to what y'all are going to talk about, and just jot. You can just bullet list them. I don't need complete sentences, okay? But just like bullet it, and then how do those 4 topics, or how those 4 icons contribute to the bigger meaning of the piece? Does that make sense? All right, let's see y'all do it.
Okay. Well, we're going to raise like each
Yes.
Snacks.
Yeah. Specific about
I think so.
You could do writing and argumentative paper
About like, each of us, we take turns, bullet pointing some things about this. And at the end, we'll just share with us our ideas.
Obviously,
But they have to have the website. We'll get you there.
line together.
I don't know, I just put this out.
So what did you let me off, right?
Oh, have you not?
Oh,
Okay, well, you can have one to this one. And because then you can just have turns or something.
I feel and he lies. He lies.
Oh, no, actually.
Cross district, she lies.
after he says.
So,
Turning into within a few sentences.
We're allowed to propose reference.
Are we allowed to write on this?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
I didn't know if we were literally writing.
Oh, you can literally write on it.
Harris's priority.
Sorry.
Oh, we were talking about
The plane crash? And then you can like write things about planes.
But then are we trying to hold the bigger
Yeah.
So
maybe more of
like
one concept about like racism and
yes,
stuff.
and we're all coming up with an idea about one topic. One topic, but.
Handwriting's so nice.
Things like,
Yeah.
so based on
There's so many
something
other
that-
Okay, so,
the topic will not answer questions. What are the flies or maybe?
Because we know the historical.
Okay, so.
But military life is guessing, right? Like, he actually doesn't show
The
that.
survival
Oh,
skill.
yeah. Yeah, what happens to Elizabeth at the end? I mean, I know I always go over what actually happened after we
Ethics
finished
and
the
survival
play.
is like,
I always
charge
it
because they fight a lot over
Yeah.
different hobbies.
It just ends with the drama.
And then the work cycle plans. They have to
Yes,
like,
and you're
memorize
right.
each
Yeah.
one.
Elizabeth good, or no, I always she lives and she goes on to live and it's
Like, also like, shading to the top.
They talk, you know, I always have to remind each other people in jail.
So that would be that right or wrong.
No, I always just,
The rules.
I always just, no, it's, I tell them what actually happened.
But that in history,
Yeah.
I don't know how to spell that, but. My wife had a good example of
I have some pictures I always show like,
Like this one would go there.
Physics will be.
Like it's just.
I have a picture of Bridget Bishop. But I think he gave,
So ethics
what
would
happens
be
to
more
him,
like,
he doesn't really
um,
like it. I always tell him.
okay, do we want to get specific? Okay, so it's like, was it right to take these classes?
Yes.
Okay, or like, these classes right now?
He's like,
Probably not.
Are you kidding me? I had a stroke.
We can even talk about the stereotypes.
Hunting or, yeah.
and there's also historical.
I've had kids bring that up a lot.
So you take what role? Yeah.
Yeah.
Finger time.
Any dance?
Do I like obviously?
In the head or like?
That would not be.
Would it be
But
like,
like,
yeah,
yeah,
Second, my fifth,
is it
second
an
one.
impairment that
After Gatsby.
Yeah, we,
Well, I mean, I'm sure it would have gotten some sort of.
No, I think that was really,
well, like, historical. But you know, like, had happened, I mean, he would have been killed. Like, either way, like, they were gonna kill him. Yeah, I mean, like, but today, we'd be like, hey, was he mentally competent? You know what I mean? Like, does he need to be here? Does he need to be rehabilitated? That kind of thing.
Well, it's nice to be parts more like, let's say they're like, right, and you're right, and it's like, oh, wait, that's not, what do you even do language?
So I think that would be.
Whatever you like. Rules?
That was well, I guess we could say mental health and psychology.
Great Depression, Dust Bowl, migrant workers.
But it's across the wall.
Yeah, that's gonna be a little tough, but I'm trying to like get stuff in these boxes.
What's your topic?
That was horrific.
My
You want to be right, give me the other one. It doesn't make sense.
She's seducing.
Accidentally like clicked my finger before writing and like back up and like right across the kills me.
Are these TV or yes?
Like response.
Thank you.
He really just needs to be about survival, but that is every state I wanted.
It is kind of what we were talking about today too.
I guess
There's reasonings towards like.
using the Bible.
Disability.
a mic drop.
Yeah.
Well, we're in it, so, you know.
So that's a little fun, but what we get to with the kids.
Randy's like, finally, today, something we know.
Yeah, so maybe we're like, here's the plan, the younger children are not.
This
Great as adults, the motivation to drive. We're not sure, just
Yeah, so like how, based on that topic and these things, how does that contribute or formulate like a big idea?
Would I like take all of this?
This focus, and then it might be like this helps build your ideas, but it's more you kind of fleshing out the survival part of it.
So if I were writing an essay, survivor, there would be some details like.
Correct, yes.
So my big idea would be like, or not like a stereotype. Okay, it's important to look out for others because they weren't watching the younger children and this kid died.
What if we say something like
Abstract
not allowing
idea.
mass hysteria to change the course of justice? So the American
So this could actually be like a good kind of organizer too if we're trying to get them to write an essay.
Like, not that it's on him, but like all these different things that we change the course of justice.
Yeah, and then they talk too, like maybe you have those lower kids and all they can do is pick out details about, you know, the setting or whatever, right? So if you're actually like, hey, this is my class, like that group, Right, so what details are given about survival?
So maybe if I were presenting and I wanted them to produce things like this, like your turn. I would have to say, for the details.
All right, just a few more minutes and then we're gonna have a couple shares.
That make survival easy or hard.
Yes.
David picked that class like survival or should it be something more like setting, and then we're talking about.
It's whatever you want, it's whatever you want, it's whatever you want. Thanks, Mary.
If I wanted to produce a theme, I probably need something like this, but if I put setting there, it might be better to have some sort of theme.
That came out of it through the setting.
So if I put like setting here and then I give details about like what and uninhabited island.
I can't even hold up kids like so I'm not even out of it about if you're thinking about survival that could kind of
One of the many.
sometimes it's
Healthcare.
I can't even drop right there. I can't even see like.
That's cool. That's right.
On American Dream, and you can show them how
I think we're great, yeah, well, you have to be.
Honestly, we would need a STEM in each of these.
Until they learn or draw
And like down here, maybe it's STEM, so if this were setting, I'm not going to be something like, because of the setting, you know.
It's exclusive. Just one.
So then is it really, is it really the American dream that not everybody can attain it?
See, I do it like that.
Like we did, I mean, it's kind of the talent.
I'm not even thinking about my board slides, we've got this idea of survival, what other topics do you see in the board slides?
Game happens.
Yeah, the heat blowing, yeah.
Okay, child studies.
Friendship.
Friendship. How much? So it'd be kind of intriguing because
I'm sure you.
Before I asked them if they do that too. And they looked at me like I was crazy. So I started asking them, and if you joined in on the chorus.
I feel like honestly, we're
Live.
really, so I'm gonna go to just.
Alright, how was that? Okay, I'm just gonna have a couple of you share kind of what you came to. The Crucible group, let's hear what they did.
My voice is starting.
Because you're taller, that makes sense. Okay, so we did the Crucible, and so we chose unanswered question, ethics, trends, and rules. So for like, this is what we did with the big idea was we kind of just took these, we need to turn, we need to go up front.
No, you're good.
Oh, I can go up front.
Nope, I already got you.
Okay.
So we took the three, right, ethics, rules, and what is it, trends?
Trends.
And we kind of merged those all together because the unanswered questions really didn't work all together. So like for ethics, we talked about, you know, the greed, you know, naming your neighbors to get something out of it. The idea of lying to save yourself, right, instead of getting into trouble. But then that also rolled into, right, the trends where we talked about McCarthyism, and then kind of like that scare with the pandemic now. You know, where it's that idea of tattling on your neighbor or that mob hysteria, which also led into kind of our rules too, right, with the Puritanism, the not separating church and state. So everything that the church did became law. So we kind of rolled that into with the big idea of not allowing mass hysteria to change or alter the course of justice and of truth.
Hey, that's snaps.
Oh, snaps, I'm sorry.
This is a jazz.
Sorry, that's a habit. All right, for sophomore group, mice and men.
Oh, so sophomores. Full disclosure, I'm not a sophomore teacher, but I'll do it. Except for like one, right? Okay. So we did mice and men. So we talked about. Say what?
Oh, I got a little paper.
So yeah, we had a mice and men, and for ethics we talked about like euthanasia and keeping somebody from reaching a divisive end. Let's see, across disciplines we did historical context of Great Depression, Dust Bowl, and migrant workers. That is very evident today. Change over time, mental health care, racism, sexism, social injustices, and economy. And then we had repetitive behavior for patterns, storytelling, work cycles, and conflict. And so our overall big idea was that the American dream is only attainable for a small few. So very exclusive to certain people.
But think about like your English 2 level students. Can they do this?
Definitely, they definitely do.
Right, and look at what they're talking about, right? Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah, these are snaps.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right, so just kind of take a moment, and if you want to talk about it first in your group, then come back, or we just want to do a whole class, it's up to you. But so what are some other ways, you know, and think about like what you are already doing in your classroom. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's like, how can you add a little bit more, like a little depth in thinking or stuff? How do you think you could use this in your classroom moving forward?
We were talking about just how it helps to keep things maybe a little bit more organized. And so when we're reading through something, yeah, it's cool to be able to do the wheel and like pop a question on them, and that encourages that higher level thinking. But also it would be really cool to just be like, okay, today we're talking about trends, and have it up on the board with the list like you guys did of this is what that kind of means. And this is what we're going to pick out as we're reading today to kind of organize people's thoughts in a certain direction.
I like it. So then you could also use that, like the brainstorming of the writing process too.
We talked about that too. Like if this is going to be the topic that I give you and you need some sort of question that you're going to answer or something, you're going to have all these details anyway. So you may start thinking about what 4 things do I want to concentrate on and brainstorm that way. Anybody else?
I think it also gives students an opportunity to talk about things that interest them or relevant to them, because I think sometimes in literature, kids can't relate, right? So giving them some of these, you know, maybe they understand, you know, the ethics part more than anything because they can relate it to their own lives or those kind of things. So I think it keeps them structured, but at the same time keeps it fresh and relevant, meaningful to them.
Anybody else? So these are just a couple of other things, and this stuff is also in our shared folder. So it's in our ELA department drive under resources, under depth and complexity. And What's cool about this is you can print this out and they can write on top of it, and there's also a frame maker where they have the icons up top and they can pull down the icons and then type into text boxes as well. But then it's kind of similar to this, but they can choose which ones they want to talk about, or maybe you can already have it, predetermined depending on what you want to do. But you have the big idea in the middle, and then those details, how it changes over time, and then it kind of turns into kind of a more structured, I think, like one-pager almost. They could do the visuals with it or whatever they wanted to. I thought this was really cool, because it says use a Post-it and write a new something you learned from the story, and then it has the icons over here, and then there's the Post-its and they could write. And I thought that was really cool about like to brainstorm or to check for understanding on the way out or anything like that. And then they kind of use this concept with the Venn diagram, and they use the details and the change over time. But then like the other group had added trends. So I think that's kind of that manipulation of the groups too, right? You have a group that's going to blow through details in this, so add another icon to them and ask them to challenge themselves a little bit more and see if they can kind of make the connection. And they did this in regards to like characterization. And then I thought that was really neat, that multiple and that ethics. And then they kind of posed a question, and then that's, we're able to go there from there. So I don't know, just some different ways to use the big easel posters, and I just feel like it's a lot of information, but there's so many different ways to use these, and that's what we thought was really neat about the whole. I threw this on the slideshow. I found this. I did not make this. But it was about introducing the icons to the class and how to introduce them and how to, kind of train them to understand what each one means by association. So I thought that was really kind of neat. If this is something like, where do I start? How do I get this going in my classroom? Because I really want to. Because that's something I certainly don't want. Like, this is really cool. We see how it's useful, but then we get kind of standoffish because we don't know how to introduce it to the class. Then a few other, there's the digital icon wheel. There's a Google Chrome extensions that will install the icons to your computer, and you can put them into like PowerPoints and stuff like that. This one is like just overall, like whatever you need to know, anything that missed or we missed coming through. It's kind of more of like a blog setup, and it's done by subtitles of questions. The Gifted Guru is the lady that actually trained us, and so she has a whole introductory video on her website to kind of help you introduce the icons as well. And then we have the license to the J. Taylor Magnolia ISD resource, and you can pull any of the other resources that we have with it. And then we thought this was cool. Another way to use it is to put the Padlet on. This is from our training, but you can put the icon up there, and then they can start, putting their ideas up on the front, as an exit ticket or whatever. All right, so all I'm going to ask is, I really appreciate your time today. I shared with you a Google form, and just a real quick feedback. Let me know how we did today, how relevant it was, anything that we can improve upon. And then most importantly, I want to know what you want to learn about next. Of course, they won't always be the longer ones. They'll be quick little snippets of information, but if you could do that for me, I would really appreciate it. Really appreciate y'all.